Is the member for Fairfax seeking the call?
Yes, Deputy Speaker. On behalf of the Standing Committee on Environment and Energy, I present the committee's advisory report incorporating dissenting reports on the Climate Change National Framework for Adaptation and Mitigation Bill 2020 and Climate Change National Framework for Adaptation and Mitigation Consequential and Transitional Provisions Bill 2020, together with the minutes of proceedings, and I ask leave of the House to make a short statement in connection with the report.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
The member for Fairfax.
Deputy Speaker, I present the report of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Environment and Energy's inquiry into the Climate Change National Framework for Adaptation and Mitigation Bill 2020 and the related Consequential and Transitional Provisions Bill. Climate change is one of the world's most challenging and complex areas when it comes to public policy, and that includes here in Australia. What is often left unrecognised amidst the growing ambition to decarbonise Australia's economy is our strong track record in emissions reduction and also in emissions accounting and reporting. The evidence that came before the committee in this inquiry bore these facts out. Australia is not only meeting and beating its international obligations, but is on track to beat its 2030 emissions reduction target, and work is already being done to determine a longer-term emissions reduction pathway in line with our commitment to achieving net zero as soon as possible and preferably by 2050. Australia's reporting and accountability framework is world-leading, providing quarterly reporting on emissions, annual forecasts and an annual low-emissions technology statement. However, no area of public policy is without room for improvement, and the climate change bills proposed by the member for Warringah was welcomed by the committee as a contribution to the discussion. The committee, as it always does, diligently considered the proposed bills and the evidence that came before it from those who made submissions and appeared before the committee as witnesses. In its report, the committee has commended positive aspects of the bills, including requirements to consult with experts and the community in framing future climate policies, and the importance of ensuring fair employment transition for those industries and workers impacted by change. The committee also supported better utilising the Climate Change Authority as an expert advisor to government and working towards even greater clarity of future emission reduction plans in advance of this year's United Nations COP26 conference. At the same time, however, the committee's inquiry identified deficiencies in the proposed bills. Let me outline just three. Firstly, the bills proposed a climate change commission which would steer formal policy decisions away from the parliament and the executive to an unelected body. Our system of liberal democracy is well recognised as one of the most mature and well-functioning in the world, and it is imperative that its integrity be maintained. No matter how difficult it is to meet the substantive and political challenges of climate change, we parliamentarians cannot shirk our responsibility to determine the national response. What's more, the Australian people should not be stripped of their right to choose between alternative policy positions at the ballot box. Their voice, the people's voice, especially on an issue as important as climate change must be protected. Secondly, the proposed Climate Change Commission would replicate work already being done by the federal bureaucracy, including by the Climate Change Authority, and the bills, if they were passed and enacted, would place additional and potentially inappropriate reporting burdens on other Commonwealth agencies. Thirdly, the proposed requirement to reach net zero emissions by 2050 by legislative force, without recognising the importance of addressing the question of how such targets can be achieved, would give rise to a series of risks across the economy, specific sectors, and also the jobs of hard-working everyday Australians. Deputy Speaker, does this mean that net zero should not be considered or pursued? No. No, it doesn't. Indeed, the Australian government has already committed to achieving net zero as soon as possible and preferably by 2050. But it would be irresponsible for a government to legislate for such a hard target on the what and the when without due consideration for the how. And it is for reasons such as these, Deputy Speaker, that the committee has recommended that the bills not be passed. Climate change is a global problem that can only be solved with a global solution. Australia is making its contribution, a strong contribution. And as we continue to do so, we should have confidence that our climate objectives can and should be achieved using our existing, proven, world-class climate policy architecture. In a liberal democracy like Australia's, it would be unrealistic, dare I say naive, to expect a national consensus to emerge where everyone agrees on one specific suite of policies to tackle the issue of climate change. And that's not a bad thing, I suggest, Deputy Speaker. You see, liberalism and its two tenets of democracy and capitalism are a strength, not a weakness, when it comes to tackling a challenge as intractable as climate change. It's what allows open debate on public policy, and it's what allows enterprise to consider new and emerging technologies. Can I lastly, Deputy Speaker, thank my colleagues on the committee from the Liberal, National and the Labor parties, along with the crossbench who actively participated in and brought a critical lens to this inquiry, and I pay tribute, of course, to the ever-capable committee secretariat. I commend the report to the House.
I thank the member for Fairfax. I understand that the member for Fremantle is wishing to seek leave to also speak on the report. The member for Fremantle has the call, or is the member for Fremantle is seeking leave?
Yes, I am, Deputy Speaker.
The minister, is leave granted? The minister. Leave is granted. The member for Fremantle has the call.
Deputy Speaker, I'm glad to make some brief remarks on the tabling of the committee report from the inquiry into the private members' climate change bills introduced by the member for Warringah, who is also a member of the committee. At the outset, I thank the Secretariat for their work in assisting the committee. I acknowledge the effort and application of my fellow committee members under the often very reasonable stewardship of the Chair, the member for Fairfax. Deputy Speaker, the bills in question seek to address a harmful policy vacuum that has been created by the present government, namely the absence of a plan to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with the science, in step with the international community and in response to the steepening environmental and economic impacts of inaction. The majority report recommends against the bills. Labor members of the committee believe the bills have merit and should be properly considered, as set out in our additional comments within the report. Australia previously had an effective economy-wide framework for tackling climate change and supporting the necessary energy sector and broader economic and social transition, and that was Labor's Clean Energy Future scheme. It was removed by the Abbott government, making Australia the only jurisdiction in the world to adopt and then abandon a systemic approach to decarbonisation. While the structure and measures outlined in the member for Warringah's climate change bills are not precisely the way that Labor, if elected to government, would tackle this critical and urgent challenge, Labor members of the committee nevertheless recognise that it presents a considered proposal and should be debated in the Australian Parliament. To some considerable degree, the bills follow the United Kingdom's approach of legislating an emissions reduction target for 2050, establishing an emissions budget framework to guide progress within 5-year periods, and creating an independent climate change commission to advise on science and policy, and to monitor and report on outcomes. To the extent that that's the approach that the United Kingdom has taken, it's hard to understand how anyone would argue that that approach is somehow incompatible with the basic shape and principles of Australian democracy. In any case, Labor members support the need for the Australian government to adopt a commitment of achieving net zero emissions by 2050, a position shared, of course, by our international peers, by every state and territory government in Australia, and by every significant business and industry stakeholder group, from the National Farmers Federation to the Business Council of Australia. Not surprisingly, that strong consensus was also reflected in the submissions to this inquiry. Deputy Speaker, the principal themes of the evidence of the inquiry were as follows. First, that action on climate change is vital. Australia is clearly not doing enough. Second, there are clear economic and trade benefits of being a proactive and cooperative part of the international decarbonisation effort through the global energy transition that is occurring. Third, that further inaction puts Australia at serious risk, and the longer we delay, the more the costs and the risks grow. And fourth and finally, there is a huge opportunity for Australia to benefit from our advantages in innovation, energy, minerals, synergistic industries, and high-quality renewable resources of every kind. Deputy Speaker, I note that Labor members of the committee supported 6 alternative recommendations that were not adopted as part of the inquiry report. In addition to the recommendation that the bills be considered and debated by the Parliament, these also included sensible further steps like undertaking a full assessment of the sectoral costs of climate change. I note there are news reports this week of the ABARES assessment that farm profits have reduced on average 23% between 2001 and 2021 because of climate change. Deputy Speaker, it's also worth noting that a successful amendment to the report from the member for North Sydney included the claim that the Australian government has committed to achieving net zero emissions as soon as possible, and preferably before 2050, when there is no such formal commitment. If there is a formal commitment, then the government should be clear exactly when that was made and what actual weight and imperative sits behind that commitment that we have heard often over the last few months. The Morrison government's only present commitment is to reach net zero by the second half of the 21st century. In other words, by 2099. The assertion that there is a commitment to achieve net zero as soon as possible and preferably before 2050 is really just an example of tricky political wordplay, and I think we've all had enough of that. Finally, Deputy Speaker, Labor members note that to a large extent the policies, programs and supporting agencies referenced during the inquiry as being effective in the twin task of decreasing emissions and increasing renewable energy capacity and energy efficiency were, of course, established by the previous federal Labor government. Bottom line is that under this third-term coalition government, Australia continues to suffer by having neither a national energy policy nor a national commitment to and framework for achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions necessary to protect Australia from the acutely harmful environmental, economic and social impacts of climate change. Deputy Speaker, I acknowledge the work undertaken by the member for Warringah and her staff in formulating the bills which were the subject of the inquiry, and thank the thousands of Australians who took the time to make their views known, the vast majority of whom called on the Australian Parliament and the Australian Government to do better in addressing the most enduring and all-encompassing challenge of our time, which is climate change. I thank the House.
Order. The member for Warringah is seeking the call.
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I speak?
Is leave granted? I call the minister. Leave is granted. I call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Standing Committee on the Environment and Energy was tasked with inquiring into the climate change bills that I presented in November last year. And the committee received over 6,500 submissions and had 3 public hearing days with some 49 witnesses appeared. And witnesses and submissions were over 99.9% in support of the approach proposed in the bills. As part of the process, the committee reports on the inquiry to the Australian Parliament. And this is really important because we desperately need to have a sensible discussion around climate change policy and emissions reduction away from electioneering, where it becomes a point-scoring exercise between both major parties. But I must at least start by thanking the committee members for their hopefully open mind to hearing the evidence and hearing from so many across Australian civic society who want better policy on this. To the Secretariat, who I know worked incredibly hard dealing with the vast amount of submissions, and especially to all those that have participated in the inquiry that made the submissions, both individuals but also organisations. This was vitally important for so many organisations to be on the record for how global warming and climate impacts and all the risks associated are going to impact their sector and what they need to see from the government, from the opposition, by way of good policy. It was unfortunately not possible to reach bipartisan agreement on the Chair's final report and recommendations flowing from the inquiry. And sadly, whilst this kind of inquiry should be capable of bipartisanship and a coming together on such an important policy issue, what we saw was still a divide along political party lines. And despite the evidence received being overwhelmingly in support of the bills, all government members of the committee refused to incorporate the full extent of the support in the main report, even from a point of view of referencing the evidence, but also in relation to recommendations that were put forward to either progress the bills, but also progress the development of Australian climate policy. Now, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has on a number of occasions stated that Australia would not be told by the international community what Australia's climate policy should be. And the member for Fairfax again reiterated the need for liberalism and policy and that this should be left to the Australian people. But here was the opportunity to listen to a really broad section of the Australian public, the Australian civic society, environmental groups, business groups, industries, unions, health professionals, on what is needed by the government to address the policy issues of climate change. But still, the government members on the committee were not willing to acknowledge that better policy is needed in Australia. It was still a question of maintaining the line that we are going to meet and exceed and we are doing enough. Deaf to the cries of so many and the pleas of so many that this policy area needs to shift. It needs to move away from being a political football to an area of consensus, like we have consensus on major health issues, like we have made consensus on issues of defence. So it really is a question. It is disappointing, and it was disappointing for so many, that in fact that political partisanship could not be set aside for a moment to progress this policy area. I believe many members of the coalition, in particular the member for North Sydney, are in fact embarrassed by the position of the government and their own failure to act on climate change. And through the whole committee process, members like the member for North Sydney were looking for excuses not to support the approach proposed in the bills. They were looking for reasons to go against the recommendations. And even the member for Fairfax, in presenting the report just now, talked about a major reason being that we couldn't hand it to unelected experts to advise government on what good policy should look like. It's just strange, this approach when it comes to climate change, to take issue with unelected experts advising government, when for the last 18 months, the government has followed the advice of unelected chief medical officers in its response to COVID, and it has had no qualms in imposing restrictions and following the expert advice and establishing an unelected COVID committee for a coordination.
For Warringah, the Minister has a call.
Mr Deputy Speaker, leave was granted on the basis of speaking about the report. It's the members' contributions are now straying a little bit away from the report, the committee's deliberations and how they've reached them. So I'll just perhaps call on the member to bring her remarks back to that and perhaps wrap up her contribution.
The member for Warringah has the call.
Well, I thank the Minister for that, but I would note this was the very point the member for Fairfax made in his speech. The reality is we do need to listen to the independent experts on this policy area. The overwhelming submissions in response to this inquiry wanted that. The main report and the lengthy dissenting report makes clear the evidence established the demand and the need for clear policy on this area, that a risk assessment, a national risk assessment needs to be done, that we need clear adaptation plans to address that, and we do need to legislate our pathway to net zero so that the business community, the investment community, industry, but also working communities that currently are facing a very real and significant transition know what that pathway will look like. Putting our heads in the sand will simply not resolve this. So this inquiry was vitally important. These bills are needed now more than ever because the government does not have a clear policy in this area. The bills, the subject of this inquiry and of this report are based and very much modelled on conservative policy in the UK. They are a demonstrated model that works. And I urge the government to look at the recommendations and implement clear policy that responds to the clear need that was identified during the inquiry. It is evidence from organisations like the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Medical Associations, and so many in our communities, that they want clear policy. They do not want divisive policies around this. The core elements of the bills establish that the 5-yearly budgets for emissions reduction be established. And that is something that provides policy certainty that is desperately needed for. We know that our international trading partners are all committed to this. They are moving forward. And whilst it is vitally important as we move towards Glasgow and COP26 that we progress Australian policy. This bill, put forward as a private member's business bill, was done so with the goal to actually bring together both sides of politics for the benefit and future of Australia long term. This is an area of policy that desperately needs partisan politics to be put aside so that for the good of the nation, the good and the safety of Australia long term, we have clear policy. It is an existential threat. As the member for Fairfax made clear, climate change, the risks, global warming, these are existential threats. They are existential threats from a point of view of our environment, but also our economy. The cost to the economy will be so large. It does not bear thinking about the impact to future generations if once they have the burden of the last 2 years with the COVID pandemic, on top of that, leaving them an unresolved burden of climate change and global impacts. These bills seek to put in place a sound framework to address these challenges. And I really urge government members and coalition members to really take on board what their legacy will be if they fail to embrace sound policy that needs to happen. We are seeing it at state level. We need to see it at federal level. This report, ironically, paves the way as we approach an election for more independence to try and put forward solutions that are simply not stuck in political partisanship. So I thank the committee for its work. I express my disappointment that coalition members of the committee were not able to put aside political party allegiance and actually address and engage the very real issue of climate change and the need for a clear policy to reduce our emissions. Thank you.
Order. I call the honourable member for Fairfax.
Deputy Speaker, I move that the House take note of the report.
The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made an order of the day for the next sitting. I call the honourable member for Fairfax.
Deputy Speaker, I move that the order of the day be referred to the Federation Chamber for debate.
I'll put that question. All of those of that opinion say aye.